All right, let's dive into the DRC crisis, shall we? You've sent us these two articles, one from the New Times of Rwanda and one from IGIE. They both talk about these recent upcoming summits, but it seems like they have different ideas about how to fix things.
Yeah, it's like, two different cooks trying to make the same dish. We've got two big players trying to stabilize things. SADC, the Southern African Development Community, and then the East African Community, the EAC. They both want to bring peace, but they have different approaches, so who knows what's going to happen, right? Will they work together, or will it be a total mess?
Okay, well, let's start with the EAC summit that's just finished up. It looks like they're really pushing for dialogue to solve the problem.
Absolutely, yeah. The EAC wants the DRC government to talk directly with all the armed groups in the conflict, even M23, and find some kind of common ground. But here's the thing, President Tshisekedi, he sees M23 as terrorists, and he actually skipped the summit altogether.
Oh, wow. That's like inviting someone to a party, then they just don't show up. How can you have a real conversation if one of the main people isn't even there?
Well, yeah, it definitely makes things more complicated. Tshisekedi not being there shows just how much distrust there is and how hard it's going to be to get everyone on board with this whole talking thing. He's probably feeling pressure at home, if he negotiates with a group he calls terrorists, he might look weak, and that could hurt his support.
So he's putting a lot of faith in, the military?
Yeah.
But is that really going to bring lasting peace?
That's the big question, right? I mean, military action, it might work for a little bit, but if you don't address the real reasons behind the conflict, the root causes, any progress is going to be temporary. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a serious wound,
And to make matters worse, it seems like there's some tension brewing. The New Times article mentions President Kagame of Rwanda and how he straight up denied what South African President Ramaphosa was saying about the DRC.
Right, yeah. All these different opinions just show how delicate everything is. There's so much history, so many competing interests, that it's like everyone's playing this high-stakes chess game and the whole region is watching what happens.
Speaking of players, the IGI article mentions that SADC already has their military mission in the DRC, Sama DRC, with troops from South Africa, Tanzania, and Malawi. They're on the ground trying to contain the violence.
Right, and we can't forget that these soldiers are putting their lives on the line. The article even says that some SADC troops have been killed, which just shows the human cost of this whole intervention.
So we've got the EAC pushing for dialogue and the SADC taking more of a hands-on approach. How does that work, especially with this upcoming SADC summit? Are they going to be partners or rivals?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The EAC summit actually wants to have a joint summit with SADC to try to get everyone on the same page. They're realizing that if they want to bring lasting peace to the DRC, they need to work together.
So it's almost like they're trying to bake a cake with two different recipes. Can they actually combine those instructions and make something edible, or will it be a complete disaster?
A joint effort could be really powerful. You'd have the EAC with their diplomacy and influence working with SADC's, military strength. But merging those two approaches, that's not going to be easy.
So how do you think this joint summit is going to play out? Could this be a turning point towards peace, or just another layer of complexity in this already tangled situation?
Well, it's hard to say for sure. I mean, everyone needs to be willing to compromise, If the EAC and SADC are going to present a united front, they got to find some common ground between these different ways of approaching the problem. It's like herding cats, trying to get all these different groups with their own agendas to agree on a strategy. It'll take a lot of, careful diplomacy to get everyone on the same page.
And let's not forget about President Tshisekedi and him skipping out on the EAC summit. If he doesn't even want to talk, can a joint summit actually achieve anything?
Yeah. His stance is definitely a big hurdle, a major one. Tshisekedi needs to be willing to sit down and talk, even if it means talking to the M23, for any joint effort to have a chance. Remember, the EAC wants all armed groups involved. If Tshisekedi isn't there, the M23 probably won't come to the table either.
So what are the chances that he actually changes his mind?
That's tough to say. He's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. He wants to look strong and in control at home, so negotiating with M23 is risky because, he calls them terrorists. But at the same time, the humanitarian situation in eastern DRC it's awful. The IGIE article talks about the suffering, all the people who have been displaced, the casualties, the fear.
So he has to find a way to keep his supporters happy while also recognizing that peace is really urgent. Do you think this joint summit could make him change his mind?
It might, yeah. If the EAC and SADC can really show a united front, It might put enough pressure on Tshisekedi to reconsider. If they work together and combine SADC's military presence with, the EAC's diplomacy, that might offer a solution that tackles both the security issues and the need for, talking things out.
Well, let's hope so. But even with a joint summit, this DRC situation is it's so complicated. There are just so many questions, so many things that could go wrong.
Oh, absolutely. And a big unknown is what Rwanda will do. President Kagame denying what President Ramaphosa said, like the New Times article mentioned, suggests there's some tension there. Rwanda's been accused of supporting M23, which they deny. But their history with the DRC, especially what happened during the Rwandan genocide, creates a lot of uncertainty.
So how could Rwanda's position affect the peace process?
Well, it's hard to predict for sure. They could be helpful, using their influence to get M23 to participate in the talks. Or they could make things harder, maybe even sabotage the peace process if they don't get what they want. Either way, Rwanda has a lot of power here, and what they do will be crucial for whether any peace efforts will actually succeed.
Okay, so there are these regional power dynamics to think about, plus we have the M23 themselves.
Yeah.
What do we know about what they actually want, what their goals are?
Well, they claim to be fighting to protect the Tutsi minority in the DRC. They say the government is persecuting them. Whether their actions are justified or not, that's a whole other discussion. But understanding their perspective gives us some insight into why they're doing what they're doing. And it's important to remember that any peace agreement that's supposed to last needs to address everyone's concerns, and that includes the M23.
But based on how they've acted in the past, it seems unlikely they'll just give up and be happy to talk, right?
Yeah, you're right to be skeptical. They haven't exactly kept their promises before, and their demands have, changed over time. Some people accuse them of using negotiations just to buy time, to regroup and get stronger. Building trust is going to be really, really important, and that takes more than just words.
So it's going to take, real actions, promises they can actually keep, and a good dose of healthy skepticism.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of spoilers. It's not just the M23. There are all these other armed groups operating in eastern DRC. Some of them might resist the peace process because it threatens their power or, their control over resources. Keeping them in check, making sure they don't ruin the whole thing, that's another big challenge.
It's like trying to juggle chainsaws while riding a unicycle. Even with the best intentions, so much could go wrong.
Yeah, I like that image. But it's important not to get discouraged by how complicated everything is. Let's focus on the good things that could come out of this joint EAC-SADC summit. If they really present a united front, they might have enough leverage to get people like Tshisekedi to join the talks, even if they're reluctant. It could also help them work together on humanitarian aid, making sure that help reaches those who need it most.
It sounds promising, but I still have some questions. What if this joint summit just, falls apart? What are the backup plans?
Well, if that happens, the international community, especially the UN Security Council, will need to step in. They could impose sanctions on people who are trying to sabotage the peace process, maybe give more support to the peacekeeping mission, or even consider sending in a stronger military force if things get really bad.
So it's not just about regional players. The whole world has a responsibility to find a solution and stop the bloodshed.
Absolutely. The DRC crisis has big implications, not just for the region, but for global stability. If we don't fix this conflict, it could lead to a huge humanitarian disaster, make the region even more unstable, and maybe even spill over into neighboring countries. Everyone benefits from a peaceful resolution.
Okay, so we've talked about the summits, the need for talking, the regional dynamics, and, what could happen if things go wrong. But now I want to zoom in on something that often gets overlooked, the economic side of things.
Good point. We tend to focus on the military and the politics, but the DRC's vast mineral wealth plays a huge role in this conflict. It's like a blessing and a curse at the same time, a potential source of prosperity, but also something that attracts exploitation and greed.
It's like sitting on a gold mine, but everyone around you is trying to steal your tools. How can you build a future when everyone's fighting over resources all the time?
It's a real paradox. Armed groups, both inside and outside the DRC, have been fighting over control of these resources for years. It just keeps the violence going. Any peace agreement that's going to last has to address this. It has to ensure that the wealth from these minerals benefits the Congolese people, not just warlords or foreign corporations.
So it's not just about stopping the fighting, it's about creating an economic system that's fair and sustainable. But how do you do that when corruption is rampant and institutions are weak?
It's a huge undertaking, but not impossible. It needs a multi-pronged approach. First, there needs to be more transparency and accountability in the mining sector. The government has to crack down on corruption, make sure mining contracts are fair and out in the open, and ensure that the money made from mining is used to help people, not just enrich a few.
So no more shady deals or backroom negotiations, huh?
That's the idea. Transparency is key for building trust and making sure resources are managed responsibly. Second, the international community needs to step up and promote responsible sourcing. They need to crack down on the illegal trade in conflict minerals, make sure companies are accountable for where their materials are coming from, and make sure they're not accidentally funding armed groups through their purchases.
Wow, that sounds like a huge task involving governments, companies, and international organizations all working together.
It is, but it's essential. If the DRC is ever going to break free from this cycle of conflict and poverty, it needs a fairer and more sustainable economic system.
Okay, so we've got the economic side to think about, but we can't forget about the human cost of this conflict. The IGI Age article talked about the devastating impact on people, with millions displaced and facing incredible hardship.
You're right. It's easy to get lost in the details of summits and peace. It's hard to run a business when you're constantly worried about violence or political upheaval. That peace process we were talking about earlier is essential for creating the kind of climate where entrepreneurs can succeed.
So peace and stability are the bedrock. Everything else depends on that.
Exactly. And then we need to focus on improving what we call the business environment. That means cutting down on bureaucracy, fighting corruption, and strengthening the rule of law. All of these things are crucial for attracting investment and creating a fair and level playing field for everyone.
It's about creating an ecosystem where businesses can grow and thrive.
Precisely. And finally, we need to provide direct support to entrepreneurs. That includes things like training, mentorship, and access to financial resources. All of these things can help them develop their skills, build their businesses, and create jobs for others.
So it's a multifaceted approach that requires collaboration between governments, the private sector, and international organizations.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that peace building isn't just about ending conflict, but also about building a fair and prosperous society where everyone has the chance to succeed.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. It's been a really fascinating and thought-provoking journey. As we wrap up, are there any key takeaways you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think the situation in the DRC really shows us how interconnected peace building is. It's not just about military solutions or political agreements. It's about tackling the root causes of conflict, which often include poverty, inequality, human rights violations, and environmental damage. It requires a holistic approach, one that addresses all these things at the same time.
It's like a complex tapestry with all these different threads woven together. If you tug on one thread, it affects the whole fabric.
Exactly. And it's also a reminder that peace building takes time. It's a long process. It requires patience, persistence, and a commitment to dialogue, compromise, and reconciliation. There will be setbacks, there will be challenges along the way, but we can't give up hope.
Well said. So as we conclude our deep dive into the DRC crisis, I want to thank you for your insights and expertise. This has been a really informative and thought-provoking conversation.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged in the search for peace, both in the DRC and around the world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you on our next episode, where we'll explore another fascinating topic.